The guest for this episode is Peter Bush. Born in Lincolnshire, UK, he has translated works from Catalan, French, Spanish, and Portuguese to English. He spoke about his translations in Catalan, prominent authors in Catalan, translation as an academic discipline, and his experience at the British Centre for Literary Translation, BCLT. Bush has been active not only as a translator but also in developing literary translation as an academic discipline by working in the academic world, serving in key literary translation organizations, serving on the editorial boards of literary translation publications, and organizing international events and projects. He was director of the British Centre for Literary Translation (BCLT) at the University of East Anglia and professor of literary translation at the School of English and American Studies. He has held key positions in important literary translation organizations: Literary Translation Committee, International Translators Federation, American Literary Translators Association, and Committee for Literary Translation in Higher Education. Welcome to our podcast, Peter. Such a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Your first book-length translation, I guess, was in 1986. So tell us about what prompted you to get into translation.
I was working in a school in inner London called Holland Park School, which is a very multilingual school. And I had an advanced class of Spanish, and we'd been reading a book called Campos de Níjar by Juan Goytisolo. And my class comprised of students whose grandparents came from Spain or came from North Africa. And I thought it would be interesting for them because it was written in 1959, but it was about the poverty that their grandparents had been trying to escape from, as well as the Franco dictatorship, of course. And they weren't interested. They didn't really respond to the text. So I thought it would be a good idea to do a critical edition with an introduction. And I contacted Juan Goytisolo, and he agreed that I could do it. I did it. He liked it. And when his autobiography was published in Spain, I read it and liked it and thought it might be interesting to translate. The suggestion actually came from a fellow teacher, John Lyons, who also translates from Spanish, but mainly poetry. He's the translator of Ernesto Cardenal. I started to send the idea to publishers, and Goytisolo told his agent that he wanted me to translate it. And eventually I got a letter from a phone call from a publisher, Stephen Pickles in Quartet Books, asking me whether I wanted to translate it. And I said yes. And he asked me to do a 50-page sample because I hadn't published any literary translations before. So I did the 50-page sample, and I waited and waited. Didn't get any kind of reply. So I thought he must have just put it in the rubbish bin. So I phoned him one day and said, "What about it?" He said, "Oh, no, it's fine. Like the translation, we'll be sending you a contract." So that's how it started. Although, in fact, I signed the contract with Quartet Books, but the volume was initially contracted by North Point Press in San Francisco, and they did the editing. So my first experience of literary translation was an experience of being edited by North American editors. So that gave it another kind of interesting twist. So that was the kind of initial prompt to actually get into publishing. But if I go back to my childhood, there are various experiences that might have set me up to become later a translator, because I was born into a rural working class family. My mother and father spoke non-standard English, which is what I spoke. My first mother tongue, if you like, was non-standard English. And when I went to primary school, I was surprised when my teacher said, "You don't speak proper English." And then when I got a scholarship to go to grammar school. I was the first one in the family to go to grammar school. And the situation was worse there, really, because obviously I was surrounded by the kind of children who didn't have non-standard English. They'd only ever spoken standard English.
the first book that you translated. You said it was edited in North America. What kind of editing that they had done?
There were 2 volumes of the autobiography, and I had a different editor for each volume. And I can't remember that there were many real kind of issues. The text is it's a kind of mixture of chronological narrative mixed with stream of consciousness. Goytisolo is a very kind of complex writer, and so there's not a lot of kind of colloquialism or kind of dialogue in it. But I do remember that there were 1 or 2 things to do with sex, which they were different. They thought that what I'd said was too British. So I ended up having this discussion with an editor I didn't know about some quite intimate sexual kind of details. But in the end, we didn't have to come to a mid-Atlantic decision. We came to we got a colloquial result.
You translated books not only from Spanish but French, Portuguese too, other than Catalan that we are going to discuss about. How did you get into French and Portuguese translation?
One of the things that happened at school is that I had all these issues over English, non-standard and standard, and I had a bit of a complex about it. And what I got into was Latin, which we started learning in the first year. And I was really good at Latin. And as a result of being good at Latin, it was stream. You were in A or B or C. If you were in A, that was the top. If you were in the C, that was the bottom. I was in B, and I was booted up to A because I was good at Latin. And there I enjoyed French. And then I was given the opportunity of doing Spanish or physics and chemistry. And I'm not sure why, but I didn't like physics and chemistry. So I thought, I'm good at French and Latin, so I'll do Spanish. And I had very excellent teachers, which meant within the English system that by 16, I was reading French and Spanish literature in the original. Like I was reading a Balzac novel, I was reading in the original languages. Portuguese was different. When I was at university, I was a radical student in the late 60s, and I became involved in a kind of radical socialist group. We had a newspaper, and I worked as a journalist on this daily newspaper, and I worked as a journalist. And because I had languages, I ended up being like a foreign correspondent. I read the newspapers and wrote articles on the situation in Spain and Latin America. And I also started to read Portuguese and learn Portuguese in order to write articles on the situation in Portugal, which of course there was the Salazar dictatorship. And then after the autobiography came out by Goytisolo, my publisher, Stephen Pickles at Quartet Books, was very generous. He liked the translation and he said, what else would you like to translate? And he said, why don't you come up with some Latin American authors? Because we haven't got very much in our list that's Latin American. So I recommended Onetti, Juan Carlos Onetti, the Uruguayan writer, 6 novels by him, and I ended up translating 5 of them. So it was really a kind of lucky break in the sense that I was working with a small publisher, Quartet Books, who had this wonderful series called Encounters, where they published writers like Thomas Bernhard. And I got an open kind of road to translate Onetti. And there was a Spanish author I was interested in called Antonio Muñoz Molina. And he had a book called Beltenebros, which was a kind of noir. And Quartet Books weren't interested in it when I first took it to them. So I took it to Bloomsbury. And Liz Calder, who was the kind of one of the founders of the Bloomsbury Publishing House, she asked me to go in to have a cup of tea with her at Bloomsbury in Soho Square in London to talk about it. And so I did. I went and had a cup of tea with her. And she clearly wasn't interested in Beltenebros. And she had this book by the Brazilian singer who'd written his first novel. And she said, why don't you translate this? And I thought, I know a bit of Portuguese, but I'm not sure about whether I'd be able to translate a whole novel. Let me take it home and read it. So, which is what I did, and I enjoyed the novel. And she said, translate 40 pages, because there's already an English translation that has been rejected by Chico Buarque and his publisher in Sao Paulo, Companhias das Letras, Louis Schwartz, and also Ruben Fonseca, who had better English than Chico, and he was another advisor. Because Chico saw this novel is like a baby. It was his first novel, and he was really keen to be known as a writer as well as an important kind of singer. So I did the 40 pages, sent it off, and fortunately they liked it. I'd made a few mistakes, but they thought that I'd caught the kind of music of the style, the atmosphere in the novel. So what I did is to look at my Portuguese again, which was Peninsular Portuguese, not Brazilian Portuguese. And I got a book and some tapes, and I started to improve create my knowledge of Brazilian Portuguese. And that's how I came to publish a translation of Chico Buarque. And then I did a novel from Portugal. I did my first translation when I was 40. But I was a young translator in the sense that I didn't know anything about the publishing scene. And I soon discovered that what you had to be in England and in the United States, for that matter, was proactive. If you don't take ideas to publishers, if you don't badger, if you don't go to the London Book Fair, if you don't get involved in the whole scene, then you're going to find it very difficult to get contracts.
Now, what's your first contact with the Catalan language?
It was in Cambridge when I did my first degree in Cambridge in the mid-60s. My best friend, Brian Neild, he chose to do a Catalan option. I chose to do an option on Miguel Cervantes. I didn't do Catalan. But we were close friends and we listened to music together, and he started reading to me some Catalan poets, Jacint Verdaguer and Carles Riba. So that was my first contact with Catalan literature. And at the same time, there was a group of historians at Cambridge who were very keen on Catalan. So they were specialists in Catalan history. And so they organised a series of lectures on the history of Catalonia, which I went to. Also, I studied medieval Spanish at Cambridge. And as part of medieval Spanish, you basically you couldn't avoid Catalonia, because Catalonia in the Middle Ages was an extremely important kingdom. And because Spain didn't exist as such in the Middle Ages, it was a series of small kingdoms. And the Catalan kingdom was, in the 11th and 12th centuries, the most important kingdom in the Mediterranean, with colonized roads, and the maritime law for the Mediterranean was written by Catalans in the Middle Ages. So I had numerous kind of links to Catalan way back in the 1960s. And then at the end of the 70s, I had an opportunity to go to Spain to live for a year. And I wanted to go to Barcelona to live for a year. And that was when I seriously started to learn Catalan. But unfortunately, I didn't get to go to Barcelona. I went to Murcia in the southeast of Spain. And when I was director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at the end of the 90s, I was an active participant in the European network of literary national centres. And I started to do kind of work with Teresa Solana, who was the director of the Spanish National Centre. So we organised joint translation schools in Tarazona and in Norwich. And then our kind of collaboration at an intellectual level became something else, and we were going to have a child. So I had to decide whether we were going to live in Norwich or whether we were going to live in Barcelona. And we decided to give up both our jobs, full-time posts as directors of national centres, to become freelancers in Barcelona, which was a very kind of bold step and a very rash step. But that's when I obviously started living in Barcelona. And when I'd been there for about 2 years, I used to go back to the London Book Fair to maintain my contact with the publishing scene in the UK. And I used to always meet up with Simon Smith from Peter Owen. And he'd say, I'd pitch ideas to him, but without success. But after I'd been in Barcelona for, I think it was like 3 or 4 years, I got this email from Simon. He said, We just signed the contract for the rights to Kim Mun's La magnitude de la tragedia, the enormity of the tragedy. How do you see, what about translating it? I discussed it with Teresa, and I thought, yeah, why not? I have a go. And my first translation was from Catalan, was this novel by Kim Munzo. What I didn't realize at the time was I didn't realize how important a writer Kim Munzo is. One of the leading Catalan writers from the 1980s onwards. I mean, he's still writing. Nor did I realize that Catalonia was going to be the country invited to the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2007, which meant that throughout the world, publishers were taking an interest in Catalan literature. And I think this was part of why Peter Owen got interested as well. So yes, that's how I got started with Kim Munso and Catalan literature, translating Catalan.
You have translated both the Spanish and Catalan. How similar are they language-wise? Or what are the major differences that you have to look for?
All of the languages that I translate are Romance languages. They all have similarities, but they're all very different and unique in their own right. So the Catalan is as different from Spanish as Spanish is from French. French is from Portuguese. So in terms of translation, for me, it's not the intrinsic qualities of the languages that are the issue. What the issue is my relationship and my knowledge of these respective languages, which is at different levels and comes at different parts in my developing career. So with French, I've translated relatively little from French, but my knowledge of French goes back to when I started learning it when I was 11. And I studied French when I was at Cambridge. I've never studied academically Catalan or Portuguese. So in a sense, translating from those languages has an element of kind of beyond the normal research that a literature translator has to do with every project. It was a kind of, in a way, a voyage of discovery and exploration of literary cultures that I wasn't at all familiar with. And in particular with Catalan, as I was living in Catalonia, it was a kind of revelation, really, if you like, use that word. Because here was somebody, I considered myself to be a specialist in Hispanic literature and Hispanic culture and Latin American culture, but I'd never read Catalan literature, and I didn't know these extraordinary works existed in Catalan. And of course, you have to consider the backdrop to this, which is the history of Catalan. I mentioned the importance of the Catalan language and culture and politics in the Middle Ages, but after Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Moors in 1492, and expelled the Jews in 1492 and expelled the Moors much later. The last Moriscos left Spain in 1612. Basically, after that, the Spanish central government wanted to move to take away from Catalonia and the Basque Country the kind of rights that they'd had from the Middle Ages, and that led to a situation where Catalan was no longer recognized by the state, and in fact was the desire of the central state was to eliminate the language and eliminate the culture, but they never succeeded. But what they did succeed in doing was eliminate the existence of published written culture in Catalan from the end of, or the middle of the 16th century, so that in the 19th century, by which time Barcelona had become, and Catalonia had become like the Manchester of Spain. It was the center of the textile industry. There was a growth of a kind of Catalan bourgeoisie, a growth of a Catalan working class. As a part of that kind of expansion of power, there was a move to resurrect Catalan as in a cultural sense. So there's something called the Renaissance, and so people began to write and publish in Catalan again in the 19th century.
Now, please tell us about some of the important Catalan authors that you translated and their contribution.
I should mention the three writers, I think, who wrote novels about the Spanish Civil War, because I know that I'm not sure what the situation is in India, but in the United Kingdom and the States, when people think of the Spanish Civil War, their reference points are George Orwell, The Homage to Catalonia. George Orwell went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and he wrote this book when he came back. And also Ernest Hemingway was involved, and he wrote a novel called For Whom the Bell Tolls, as well as other kind of works with with some Spanish content. So people read Hemingway and Orwell and they see the Spanish Civil War through their perspective. And I think it's important that works that were written by people that fought in the war, who were Spanish or Catalans, that these works are translated. And some work has been translated from Spanish, but these authors, Joan Sales, Mercè Rodoreda, and Rosa Maria Arquimbao, hadn't been very much translated. And I translated Uncertain Glory by Joan Sales, and it's I think one of the finest novels written about the Spanish Civil War, or written about war. And Sales was somebody who was a Catholic and a Republican. People tend to think of in terms of the Spanish Civil War, which was started in 1936 in July by the fascist insurrection. A group in the army rose up against the democratically elected Republican government and began the Civil War. And people tend to think of it as being liberalism or Bolshevism against Catholicism, but it's not as black and white as all of that. And Joan Sales was quite a number of Catholics were on the side of the Republic, and Joan Sales was one of them. And so his novel is interesting from that perspective. It's also because he was an officer in the army and in the Republican Army, and he was sent to the front in Aragon in the countryside, where the first time he was there, he was in charge of an anarchist battalion. He was a Catholic Republican in charge of a kind of anarchist soldiers. It's a very difficult situation. But the novel is set in the countryside in Aragon at the front, but also in Barcelona. So one gets this kind of descriptions of the hardships of life for those people who are at the front, the home front. So, and I think the Uncertain Glory is a novel that has been published in India. So it is readily available in India. And Joan Sales had to go into exile in 1939. He went to Mexico. He ended up in Mexico, but he was in the Dominican Republic. But he came back in 1948 when the dictatorship was still in power, because the Francoist dictatorship lasted until 1975. So it was a kind of long period of dictatorship. And he went back in 1948 and he started writing the novel of the Civil War, Uncertain Glory. And strangely enough, it was published in 1956 under the dictatorship. And the censors, the Francoist censors, said this book should never be published. It's pornographic, it's anti the church, it's obscene, it's Marxist. But because he was a Catholic, the Bishop of Barcelona gave it the nil obstat. He said it was okay to publish it. And so the bishop trumped the dictator, and Uncertain Glory was published. And it was when it was published in 1956, it was published in a kind of censored form, because certain things weren't allowed. Although the book was allowed to be published, certain things were cut. And then when the French translation was being done, Joan Sales worked with the French translator, and in what they did was that they restored what had been cut by the censors, but at the same time, Sales actually added quite a lot to the novel. So the French translation was really the first full version to be published of Uncertain Glory. And he even added to it after then, of course, when there was a subsequent Catalan edition, he brought out this full version that had come out in French. And that's the full version that I translated. But Salas was important because he set up a publishing house called Club Editor, and he published the next book about the Civil War that I will talk about, which is In Diamond Square, which is set in Barcelona and is the Civil War from the point of view of a working class woman who gets married. She's somebody who works in a pastry shop selling cakes and bread. She gets bowled over by this young man who is a furniture maker at a fiesta in the Gracia district of Barcelona. But he gets caught up in anarchist politics and he goes off to the front and he gets killed. And she's left there with 2 children, struggling to survive. And he brought in kind of lots of pigeons. He was a pigeon fancier and he had this dream of making loads of money by selling pigeons. None of that happened, but she was always left to deal with the pigeons, which she ended up by killing. But it's a very moving novel written from the point of view of the woman. It's a stream of consciousness of an old working class woman looking back on her life. And I was very moved by it because my mother was in a different but similar situation during the Second World War, in that my father was away for 6 years, 2 years in France, and then the rest of the Second World War in the Middle East. And my mother was left with 2 daughters to bring up and just struggling to find food for them and having to do that all by herself. And the third novel that I translated from Catalan was 40 Lost Years. Now, Rodoreda became a big figure in Catalan literature. And the novel that I translated had already been translated twice. It was translated by an Irish translator and then by an American translator. So my translation was the third. And other works of Rodoreda had been translated. But Rosa Maria Arquimbao, when she was somebody who had to go into exile, she would, like Rodoreda, was a feminist and a Catalan nationalist and campaigned on these fronts during the Second Republic, and both women had to go into exile. So that one of the elements in all 3 of these books is that they're written by writers who experienced exile, and their experience of exile enriches their account of the Spanish Civil War. Obviously, Rodoreda had experience of the German invasion of France, and Rosa Maria Arquimbao, she had to go into exile. She tried to go to Latin America but failed. She couldn't get on the boat. She spent some time in a kind of concentration camp in the south of France. But she came back to Catalonia, but she never really wrote very much, and she disappeared as a literary figure. But her book, 40 Lost Years, is also about, from the perspective of a young working class woman who is a dressmaker and who is much more political than the protagonist of Rodoreda's novel. She gets involved in demonstrations. She supports the trade union. Her father was an anarchist, but she too, like the author, has to go into exile. So I think these 3 novels, which now exist in English, are really essential reading for anybody who wants to understand the Spanish Civil War and to understand the literature of the Civil War. And I'm amazed that really in Spain, for instance, in Spanish universities, very little Catalan literature is taught. And in the UK and in the US, I think it's changing now, but there has always been a resistance to teach these Catalan literary figures, which now can be taught in English since the translations are out there.
One of the other interesting things that I observed when I was going through the books that you translated, you also translated one non-fiction, interestingly, about Messi.
I like football, and I'm a Barca supporter. But that had nothing to do with the fact that I translated the book. Sometimes happen that out of the blue, you get an email from a publisher saying, would you like to translate this book? So I got this email from Short Books, a small publisher, saying, would you like to publish this book on Messi and Style by Jordi Puntí? I know Jordi Puntí and I've translated some of his short stories, but I hadn't read the book, so I read the book and liked it. It's essentially, the conceit is that Messi is like the Italo Calvino of football. So the novel is all about how Messi's style and way of playing emulates is parallel to what Calvino does in his literary writing. And it was a fun book to translate. And I must say that I'm not one of these translators who only wants to translate high literary works. I mean, I've translated a lot of classics. At the moment, I'm translating Proust, a volume of Proust, and a volume of Balzac that I've translated will be coming out in June. But at the same time, I've translated a lot of noir, and I've also translated the autobiography of Severiano Ballesteros, the famous golfer. I think that it's good to translate a variety of texts and styles because I think it loosens up your English. And also the fact is that lots of writers who are considered to be high literature have themselves. I mean, like Onetti, for instance. Onetti, when he was a kid in Montevideo in Uruguay, I mean, he first started reading, as I did actually, comics. And he used to hide in a wardrobe and read comics. So I think that, if you're going to be a full-time literary translator, meaning that you're hoping that you're going to get income from translating to pay the bills, to pay the rent and so on, then it helps to have a more open attitude to the books that you can translate. But I think that the Jordi Puntí book on Messi is a very literary book about football. The Severiano Ballesteros book about golf is not very literary. Part of it was very interesting because it explored how he went from being a golf caddy, like taking the golf clubs around the golf course, to being a leading golfer.
Now, tell us about your experience with BCLT.
I'll start before BCLT, when I was at Middlesex University. Basically, I was a part-time, half-time literary translator, and half-time I was teaching ab initio Spanish at Middlesex University, both for financial reasons and also to get out of the house, really. And at Middlesex University, there was a change of dean, and the new dean, Gabrielle Parker, interviewed all members of staff. And I was very peripheral. I was only a part-time teacher of ab initio Spanish. But anyway, she did interview me. And she said, you're translating all these interesting Latin American writers. Why don't you bring some of this into the university? And I said, yeah, sure, why don't I? And she said, why don't you think about setting up a master's in literary translation? And I'd already had some contact with the world of translation studies and with the professional translation because I became a member of the Translators Association. As soon as my first book came out, I joined the Translators Association. My father was a trade unionist, and I was brought up in a family where association and collaboration and solidarity and fighting for your rights was seen as important. So I thought, as a translator, I need to be associated. I also joined the American Literary Translators Association, which I thought, if I'm going to be a translator of English, then I've got to work with American publishers. And I also understand what happens in terms of publishing in the US. And I think it was in 1991, I went for the first time to the annual conference of ALTA. They have an annual conference. In England, the Translators Association was very business-based. There were no activities. It was all about contracts. And But in the States, that I had this annual conference, and I went there, and it was really something that I enjoyed. Here were 50 translators with workshops and readings, lectures, all about literary translation. I thought it was wonderful. And I went back to the UK, and I was on the committee of the Translators Association. I said, why don't we do something like this in the UK? And there was no interest. I must say, at that time, I was the young member. I mean, I was like 42 or 43, but most of the people on the committee were in their late 50s, and they were established translators like Barbara Wright, the translator of Raymond Queneau, and other great French writers. They were interested in their contracts, but they didn't see the point of any kind of public activity around translation. Strangely enough, at this time, I got a phone call from somebody called Mona Baker, who was at Manchester University with the translation centre there. And she said, I'm doing these, I'm organising events, and I was wondering whether you would be interested in chairing a committee for literary translation within the Institute of Translators and Interpreting. Translating and interpreting. And I said, yeah, sure. And so I got together a committee of literary translators, and we organised 3 conferences, international conferences. The first one was literary translation in higher education. The second was that was held in Warwick. The second was the practice of literary translation, and that was organised at the University of East Anglia. And the third was translation and community, that was organised in Sheffield University. And I invited people like Lawrence Venuti, Susan Bassner, the people that were active in translation studies. So I was involved in that kind of scene. And I decided that to call the MA at Middlesex the theory and practice of literary translation. And my view of translation studies was that I was enthusiastic about it because it gave translation a visibility in the university. But at the same time, I had my reservations because a lot of the teaching and a lot of the focus was on an applied linguistics approach to translation, to literary translation, and not to the practice of translation. And so I thought this MA that I'm setting up will have a focus on the practice. And because it's in London, we can draw on the professional translators that are in London to be tutors. So the idea was that the students would have to do substantial amount of literary translation as part of their course, and that these would be edited by professional literary translators, so that the students would have a sense of the realities of literary translation. And there was a theoretical element, but there was also a very practical element. Anyway, I'd been doing all of these things, and I'd helped organise stuff at the British Centre for Literary Translation. And the post became vacant, and they really wanted me to apply for it. So I applied for it, and I was appointed. And the thing is that at that time, the BCLT had regular residencies. It had funded from the EU, so that every month there would be 4 or 5 literary translators from different parts of Europe, or indeed from different parts of the UK, who were in residence. And so it gave a very kind of literary translation feel to what was happening at BCLT. There was also an MA in literary translation that was well established at UEA. So what I did was to broaden the translation studies aspect of it by starting the PhD program. But the PhD program was based on the idea that students would be able to submit a full-length translation as a PhD with a critical introduction. And this UEA was a good place to do it because that was the university that had pioneered the MAs in creative writing. So that the university itself, or the humanities, were not negative in relation to a PhD based on an actual full-length translation. So yes, the thing about being a director of the BCLT, it means that you're active within the university, but your role is to promote literary translation throughout the country. So I continued to organize conferences, seminars. I can remember that we did a lot of work with librarians to get librarians to focus on buying translations as part of as part of their normal stock. We got a grant to put on a translation of a play by a Bengali writer who lived in Oxford. We did, and I set up the summer school, the BCLT translation summer school, on the premise that there would be languages, a series of languages to be translated from, but each workshop would have a writer from that language. So we'd have a Spanish writer, a French writer, a German writer, and so on. And we also were able to get money at that stage to have translation workshops that were going into English from different languages. All of that was very exciting and innovative, I think. And there was a lecture that was given every year that was organised by the BCLT in Norwich. And I decided to make that something that happened in London. And it became the Seabelt Lecture. We organised it in places like the Queen Elizabeth Hall on the South Bank with Seamus Heaney, Susan Sontag, Carlos Fuentes, the idea being to get leading figures to make statements about literary translation, and sometimes audiences of 300 or 400 people. So I think that in a way began to give a different media perspective on literary translation. And obviously what I started with has been taken on and by people like Daniel. And so the kind of public visibility of literary translation in the UK and in the United States has changed completely from what it was in the 1990s when the Translators Association Committee didn't want to organize conferences.
Now, I have a question for you regarding translation studies. See, for anybody who is interested in improving his craft as a translator and who wants to become, let's say, a professional translator, how does this taking an academic route help?
At the moment, I get the impression that most young translators in the UK and the US are coming to literary translation through the academy. In the States by doing MFAs, or in the UK by doing Masters in Literary Translation. And I think that this is fine. My only caveats are that thinking is not simply thinking about doing a literary translation isn't about simply thinking about translation. You have to have a critical perspective that has been broadened by reading philosophy, aesthetics, history, politics. You have to have a high level of general culture in order to translate as a professional translator. And you have to have a critical perspective on research, because each novel that you translate or each play that you translate has a set of different research tasks within it. For instance, I'm translating this volume of Proust now, which is the third volume of À la recherche du temps perdu, and it's one of the volumes that most centers on the Dreyfus affair. So I've had to relook and reread about the Dreyfus affair as part of doing the translation. I think that, to be frank, a lot of the writing that there is in translation studies is writing which bears no has no kind of reality. There's very little regard for publishing. There's very little regard to the whole process of editing that takes place, because it's like when you work for an academic publisher, it's very different to working for a trade publisher. They have different routines, they have different perspectives, they have different rhythms. And I think that a lot of the writing of translation studies has been done by applied linguists who have no sense of the reality of the translation process. And it's a bit like in the 18th century in Spain, because of the predominance of the Inquisition, doctors weren't trained by looking at the body. It was thought heretical to look at a body because that went against the teachings of the church and of the classics. And I have the sense when I read some translation studies material is that this is something that is worked out in abstract without any kind of empirical analysis of the process of translation. And here I think that there's a key role for archives of the work of literary translators. It seems to me that much of what is done in translation studies should be revamped to look at the edits and the edits done by publishers on translations, the edits and re-edits that are done by translators on their own translations, and also the kind of interaction between translators and publishers, translators and editors, translators and the writers that they're writing, and if they're dead writers, the kind of relationship that a translator has with the scholarship around dead writers and around the previous translations. Again, in terms of my translation of Proust, I've looked a lot at the translation by Scott Moncrief and by Mark Traherne of the volume that I'm translating in the Penguin thing. So that it's a long answer to your question. The fact that translation now exists as an academic subject is very important for the visibility and status of translation. But it must come with an interest in the actual process of translation and publishing translations.
What are your views about the translation's accuracy and faithfulness to the source?
My sense is that it's in a way, it's a kind of non-argument. I think that obviously Nabokov, his translation of Eugene Onegin, did a very literal translation with kind of thousands of footnotes, but that's a one-off kind of exercise by a famous writer. And I think the fact that I started my translation career translating Juan Goytisolo, who is a kind of intricate thinker, a complex thinker and stylist, who basically said anything you write must break new frontiers in language. There's no point in writing if you just repeat what's been done before. And I think with translation, what you have to translate is that originality within the language that you're translating, that the writer has worked hard to create. So that, if you like, is a formulation of a certain kind of faithfulness. But it doesn't mean that it is a translation that must be word for word. Not that at all. It means that you have to transform imaginatively. And an imaginative transformation is not something that's unfaithful. It's the creative leap that's necessary in translation if one's translation is going to read like an original work. Now, that also doesn't mean that by reading like an original work that you're denying the presence of translation. Every translation has on the title page, or almost everyone, translated by. It also has more and more translated by on the front cover. Any kind of reader will be alerted to the fact that they're reading a translation by those two markers. I feel I know Larry Venuti very well, and we've had loads of discussions and arguments about these issues. But I feel that, as I say, I think domestication of foreign sometimes students come and interview me and they say, the first question is, do you foreignize or do you domesticate? And I say, no, I translate. And I translate I translate style. And in order to translate style, you have to be sensitive to the resonances within the original language, the literary resonances within the original language. And then you have to be sensitive enough to recreate those in another language. And so more, again, it comes back to what we were discussing before, really. The essence of translation is sensitivity to rhythm and music and style to imagery. It's every time you do a draft of a translation, you're doing a rehearsal. It's in musical terms, doing a rehearsal. And the final performance is the published book. And worrying about whether you're domesticating and foreign, I mean, it seems to me a red herring.
What does the translation mean to you personally?
I obviously have a life outside translation, but I'm 78, and most of my working day is a working day when I'm translating. And I'm often asked, when you're 78, why don't you retire? And I say, why should I retire from doing something that I like doing? Translation has taken me into places that I never imagined I would ever go, both from a linguistic and literary point of view, but also from the point of view, an existential perspective, if you like. There can be a tendency to look back on life and see things as being preset or predestined, as it were. But I think that one has to realize that coincidence and chance play a big role. It's a chance that I'm teaching in a secondary school, and I decide to do something around a textbook that's set for students in a secondary school, and that leads me to do my first translation. The fact that people say to me, you ask me, why do you translate Catalan? And I said, when I went to Spain to live in Barcelona in 2003, it wasn't my intention. The idea wasn't in my head that I was going to become a kind of translator of Catalan literature. My idea was that now I'm going to be full-time. I can spend more time translating Spanish classics, and perhaps I would find more time to read French classics. The whole Catalan translation career that I've had was serendipitous. It was something that came by chance, that I moved to Barcelona because I was going to have a family in Barcelona. And it came because a particular publisher asked me to have a go at translating that novel by Kim Won-sok. I always say to young translators, you have to be proactive. And proactive means doing things perhaps that are a risk. How can you be sure that you can translate Proust? I'm a very experienced translator, but translating Proust is something that is extremely challenging. Essentially, translation changed my life, but it changed my life not by any design on my part, or not by any design on the part of translation. It was something that came out of a whole series of political, historical, and personal coincidences and activities. And I think that when I started reading Balzac when I was 16, what I loved about Balzac was his sense of the workings of society as a whole, and the way that individual lives are conditioned by history and politics, by emotion, and by chance. And that's what you grasp in the Comédie Humaine by Balzac. And I found that reflected my own personal family experience. A mother and father who met as a result of the Irish famine, the depression in the Welsh mining. Who could have predicted that my mother and father would ever have met? And isn't that what life is like? It's something that is very unpredictable, and that can be very positive, but it can also be very negative.
Thank you for such an enriching conversation. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye-bye.